Picture this. It's a Thursday afternoon in downtown Chicago, inside one of those upscale restaurants where a single appetizer costs more than some people spend on groceries for a week. A man in a $15,000 suit sits at a corner table, about to take the first bite of his $45 Wagyu beef tartare. His hand is halfway to his mouth when a small hand, couldn't belong to anyone older than 8, shoots across the table and knocks the fork right out of his grip. The raw beef scatters across the white tablecloth. The sterling silver fork clatters to the floor. And standing beside his table, breathing hard like she just ran a marathon, is a little girl with tangled hair, wearing clothes that have seen better days, her eyes wide with an urgency that seems completely disproportionate to the situation. Before anyone in the restaurant can react, before the security guard can rush over, before the man can process his shock and anger, the little girl says 5 words that will change everything. "You can't eat that, mister." What happens next didn't just go viral on social media. It exposed a hidden truth about the world we live in, sparked a movement that's still growing today, and proved that sometimes the smallest voices carry the most important messages. By the end of this story, you'll understand why this 8-year-old girl's desperate intervention became one of the most powerful moments of the year. Let me take you back to the beginning, because every extraordinary moment has an ordinary start. And this story begins not in that fancy restaurant, but 3 months earlier in a neighborhood just 12 miles away, a world that might as well exist in a different universe. Her name was Sophie Chun, and if you passed her on the street, you probably wouldn't look twice. She was the kind of kid who blends into the background, not because there's nothing special about her, but because poverty has a way of making people invisible. Sophie lived with her mother, Lin Chun, in a studio apartment in Southside Chicago, in one of those buildings where the heat doesn't always work in winter and the air conditioning never works in summer. Lin worked 3 jobs: morning shift at a dry cleaner, afternoon shift at a grocery store, and weekend nights cleaning office buildings when most people are home with their families. Despite working nearly 80 hours a week, she still struggled to keep food on the table. This is the reality for millions of Americans. According to the U.S. Department of Agriculture's 2023 report, more than 34 million people in America experience food insecurity, including 9 million children. That's 1 in 8 households that don't know where their next meal is coming from. Sophie was one of those 9 million children. But Sophie wasn't just struggling with hunger. She was watching her mother slowly deteriorate from something far more insidious. Lin Shin had been diagnosed with stage 3 kidney disease 2 years earlier. The doctors had been clear. Her condition required a strict diet, regular dialysis, and eventually, she'd need a transplant. But dialysis costs money. Medical care costs money. The special low-sodium, low-protein diet costs money. And money was something the Chin family simply didn't have. Lin had no health insurance. She made just enough to disqualify for Medicaid, but nowhere near enough to afford private insurance. So she made a choice that millions of parents make every single day in America. She sacrificed her own health to keep her daughter fed. She skipped dialysis appointments because she couldn't afford to miss work. She ate whatever food was cheapest, even though it was exactly what her kidneys couldn't process. And she never, ever complained, because complaining wouldn't put food on the table or keep the lights on. Sophie watched all of this happen with the kind of awareness that children living in poverty develop far too early. She understood things that 8-year-olds shouldn't have to understand. She knew that when her mother said she wasn't hungry, it meant she was giving Sophie the only meal they had that day. She knew that the bottles of pills in the bathroom cabinet were getting emptier while her mother's face got paler and her ankles got more swollen. Sophie had started spending hours at the public library after school, not because she loved reading, though she did, but because the library was warm, safe, and had free internet. She'd discovered something there that became her obsession: medical websites. She taught herself about kidney disease with the same intensity that other kids her age put into learning about their favorite video games. She learned about creatinine levels and glomerular filtration rates. She discovered that certain foods were poison for damaged kidneys. Foods high in sodium, phosphorus, and potassium could accelerate kidney failure. She learned that organ meat, processed foods, and foods rich in purines were particularly dangerous for people with advanced kidney disease. And she learned something else that would become crucial to our story. She learned that raw or undercooked meat, especially organ meats like liver or beef tartare, could contain high levels of compounds that damaged kidneys metabolized poorly, potentially triggering acute kidney injury in patients with compromised renal function. To most people, this information would be interesting but abstract. To Sophie, it was survival knowledge, the difference between having her mother for a few more years or losing her much sooner. The reason Sophie knew so much about these specific foods is because of an incident that happened 6 weeks before that day in the restaurant. Lynn had come home from her evening cleaning shift looking worse than Sophie had ever seen her. Her skin had a grayish tint, she was vomiting, and she could barely stand. Sophie, terrified and alone, had called 911. The paramedics arrived and rushed Lynn to the emergency room, where doctors discovered her kidney function had crashed to dangerous levels. They asked what she'd eaten, and Lynn finally admitted that someone at the office building where she cleaned had left takeout in the break room. Beef liver pate from an expensive restaurant. Lynn, who'd worked through her lunch break and hadn't eaten in nearly 20 hours, had eaten some of it, not wanting the food to go to waste. That small amount of liver pate, harmless to a healthy person, had triggered an acute kidney injury episode in someone whose kidneys were already failing. Sophie sat in that hospital waiting room for 7 hours, listening to doctors explain that her mother had been lucky this time, but next time she might not be. That next time, the damage could be irreversible. That night, sitting beside her mother's hospital bed, Sophie made a promise to herself. She would never let anything like this happen again. She would protect her mother from dangerous foods, even if her mother was too proud or too desperate to protect herself. Now let me introduce you to the man sitting in that restaurant, because his story is just as important to understanding what happened that day. His name was Marcus Wellington, and if you follow business news, you've probably heard of him. At 52 years old, Marcus had built a tech empire worth an estimated $3.7 billion. His company, Wellington Technologies, had revolutionized cloud computing and made him one of the youngest self-made billionaires in America. He'd been featured on magazine covers, given TED Talks, and was frequently cited as an example of the American dream. A kid from a working-class family in Detroit who'd built something extraordinary through intelligence, hard work, and ruthless business acumen. But here's what the magazines don't tell you about people like Marcus Wellington. Somewhere along the path from ambitious entrepreneur to billionaire, something fundamental had shifted in how he saw the world and the people in it. Success has a way of building walls around people, insulating them from the struggles of ordinary life. When you travel by private jet, stay in penthouses, and have assistants handling everything from your schedule to your coffee preferences, you stop encountering the reality that most people live in. It's not that Marcus was deliberately cruel or even particularly arrogant. He donated millions to charity every year, funded scholarships, and supported various causes. But there's a difference between writing checks to help people in the abstract and actually seeing them, really seeing them, as individuals with stories and struggles and humanity. Marcus had been visiting Chicago for a series of business meetings, potential merger discussions worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He'd just closed a deal that would net his company an additional $200 million in annual revenue, and he was celebrating the way wealthy people celebrate, by dining alone at one of the city's most exclusive restaurants, a place where reservations needed to be made months in advance and where the waitstaff knew better than to bother him unless absolutely necessary. He'd ordered an array of dishes that represented the kind of culinary excess that only makes sense when money is no object. The Wagyu beef tartare, a $45 appetizer made from the highest grade of Japanese beef, hand-cut and seasoned with truffle oil, quail egg, and microgreens. He'd also ordered oysters flown in that morning from Maine, a foie gras preparation that the chef was famous for, and a wine that cost more per bottle than Sophie's mother made in a month. Marcus was scrolling through his phone, reading emails about stock prices and acquisition targets, barely paying attention to the food that was being carefully arranged in front of him. This was just another Thursday, just another meal, just another ordinary moment in his extraordinary life. But Sophie's Thursday had been anything but ordinary. She'd woken up that morning to find her mother unconscious in their bathroom, blood trickling from her nose, another symptom of her failing kidneys. Sophie had called 911 again, her small voice remarkably calm as she gave the dispatcher their address and her mother's symptoms. The ambulance came, The paramedics recognized Lynn from 6 weeks earlier, and they rushed her to the same emergency room. This time was worse. The doctors were blunt with Sophie, even though she was just 8 years old, because there was no one else to be blunt with. Lynn's kidney function was now below 15%. She'd reached end-stage renal disease. Without dialysis or a transplant, she had months to live, maybe less. But dialysis required insurance or money they didn't have, and the transplant list was years long for someone without private insurance or the means to pay. One of the nurses, a kind woman named Patricia who'd seen too many cases like this, sat with Sophie in the waiting room and explained something that would haunt the child. That people with money could access dialysis immediately, could get on priority transplant lists, could afford the medications that might buy years of additional life. But people without money, people like Lin Chun, often just died while the system moved with indifferent slowness. Sophie had been sitting in that hospital waiting room for hours when she overheard a conversation that changed everything. Two women were sitting nearby, clearly wealthy based on their designer handbags and jewelry, talking about a restaurant they were planning to visit that evening. One woman was describing the menu with the kind of enthusiasm that people reserve for truly exceptional things, mentioning specifically the beef tartare that was supposedly life-changing, made from the most expensive beef in the world. The other woman laughed and said her husband loved ordering it even though she found it disgusting to eat raw meat. Something clicked in Sophie's mind, a connection between the medical knowledge she'd been accumulating and this conversation about expensive raw beef. She pulled out the notebook she always carried, the one filled with her handwritten notes about kidney disease, and found the page where she'd written about dangerous foods. She'd underlined it twice. Raw or undercooked meat, especially beef high in purines, can trigger acute kidney injury in people with compromised kidney function. She'd written it down because that's exactly what had happened to her mother with the liver pate. In that moment, sitting in a hospital waiting room while her mother fought for her life just rooms away, Sophie made a decision that most adults would never have the courage to make. If she couldn't save her own mother, if the system was going to let Lin Chin die simply because they were poor, then maybe she could save someone else's mother, someone else's parent, someone else's loved one. Sophie had no plan beyond that simple, desperate logic. She asked the nurse which restaurant those women had been talking about. The Meridian, one of the most exclusive dining establishments in downtown Chicago. She looked it up on her phone and memorized the address. When the doctors finally let her see her mother that evening, Lynn was sleeping, hooked up to machines that were doing the work her kidneys could no longer do. Sophie kissed her mother's forehead, whispered a promise that she'd be back soon, and walked out of the hospital with a determination that was both inspiring and heartbreaking in someone so young. She used the last $3 on her transit card to take 2 buses downtown, a journey that took nearly 90 minutes, standing the entire way because the buses were crowded with evening commuters. By the time she reached the restaurant district, the sun was setting and the temperature was dropping. Chicago in October can be brutal, and Sophie's thin jacket wasn't nearly warm enough. The Meridian restaurant existed in a world Sophie had only ever seen through windows. The kind of place where there's a doorman in a formal uniform, where the entrance is through a marble lobby with a chandelier that probably cost more than every possession Sophie and her mother owned combined. She walked up to the entrance, and the doorman, a man named Robert who'd been working there for 15 years, immediately assessed her with the kind of quick judgment that comes from years of determining who belongs and who doesn't. A small Asian girl in worn clothes, no parents in sight, clearly not a patron. His first instinct was to politely redirect her, but something in Sophie's eyes stopped him. There was an intensity there, a purposefulness that seemed out of place in someone so young. Before Robert could say anything, Sophie spoke up, her voice steady despite her obvious nervousness, and she said something that caught him completely off guard. "I need to go inside. Someone in there is in danger." Now, Robert had heard a lot of things in his 15 years manning that door. Excuses, arguments, pleas from people desperate to get into an exclusive restaurant they couldn't get reservations for. But he'd never heard a child claim someone was in danger inside. His training said to call security, but something about Sophie's demeanor made him hesitate. She wasn't acting like she was lying or playing a game. She looked genuinely frightened and determined in equal measure. Robert made a split-second decision that would later seem remarkably prescient. He asked Sophie what kind of danger she meant. Sophie explained, speaking quickly, about kidney disease and dangerous foods, and how someone inside might be eating something that could hurt them badly. And she knew it sounded crazy, but she had to try to warn them because she couldn't save her own mom, but maybe she could save someone else. The words tumbled out in a rush, medical terminology mixed with childish desperation, and Robert found himself believing her, not because what she was saying made complete logical sense, but because her sincerity was undeniable. He told Sophie to wait one moment, and he radioed to the maitre d', a woman named Simone who'd been running the Meridian's front of house for a decade. Simone came to the door, took one look at Sophie, and was about to dismiss the situation entirely when Robert quietly explained what the child had said. Simone, to her credit, had a moment of insight that she'd later describe as instinct. She'd seen too many things in her years in high-end hospitality to dismiss anything out of hand, no matter how unlikely it seemed. Simone crouched down to Sophie's eye level and asked her gently but directly what she was looking for, and Sophie explained about the beef tartare, about how it was dangerous for people with kidney disease, about how she needed to find if anyone in the restaurant had ordered it so she could warn them. Simone's professional demeanor shifted slightly. Beef tartare was indeed on the menu, and it was one of their signature dishes. Several tables had ordered it that evening. But here's where the situation became complicated. You can't just let a child wander through a five-star restaurant approaching diners about their medical conditions. That would be insane from a business standpoint, potentially traumatic for the guests, and likely to get the restaurant sued. Simone was about to explain this to Sophie, to gently but firmly send her away, when Sophie said something that cut through all the professional protocol. My mom is dying because she ate something her kidneys couldn't handle, and nobody warned her because nobody cared enough to warn poor people about things like that. But you can warn rich people. You can save them. Please. The raw honesty of that statement hit Simone like a physical force. She made a decision that probably violated a dozen restaurant policies. She told Sophie she could come inside, but she'd have to be extremely quick and discreet, and Simone would be with her the entire time. They entered the restaurant together, this unlikely pair, an elegantly dressed maitre d' and a small girl in threadbare clothes, moving through a dining room where the average table bill exceeded $500. Simone had a strategy. She'd quickly check which tables had ordered the beef tartare, and she'd approach those tables herself with Sophie, explaining the situation as delicately as possible. The first table they approached was a couple celebrating their anniversary, and when Simone discreetly inquired about dietary restrictions or health conditions, the couple looked confused but confirmed they were both healthy with no kidney issues. They moved on. The second table was a business dinner with four executives, and again, after Simone's careful inquiry, they confirmed no one had kidney problems. Sophie was starting to lose hope, thinking maybe she'd made this desperate journey for nothing, when Simone checked her seating chart and saw there was one more table that had ordered the tartare, table 17, a single diner who'd requested the corner table, someone named Marcus Wellington. Simone recognized the name immediately. This was not just any guest. This was someone whose displeasure could make headlines, whose criticism could damage the restaurant's reputation significantly. She hesitated, weighing her options, but Sophie didn't hesitate at all. Sophie had spotted the table before Simone could stop her. She saw a man in an expensive suit, sitting alone, his attention on his phone, a plate of raw beef arranged artfully in front of him, his fork raised halfway to his mouth. And in that split second, all the medical knowledge she'd accumulated, all the fear she'd felt watching her mother suffer, all the desperation of knowing she was helpless to save the one person she loved most in the world, it all converged into a single instinctive action. Sophie ran. She covered the distance between the entrance and table 17 in seconds, her worn sneakers squeaking slightly on the polished floor. And just as Marcus Wellington was about to take that first bite of $45 beef tartare, Sophie's small hand shot out and knocked the fork from his grip. The sound of sterling silver clattering on marble floor echoed through the suddenly quiet restaurant. Every conversation stopped. Every head turned. Marcus Wellington stared at the scattered beef on his white tablecloth, then at his empty hand, then at the small Asian girl standing beside his table, breathing hard, her eyes wide and fierce and absolutely terrified. His first reaction was shock, pure, unfiltered shock that someone had just knocked food out of his hand in one of Chicago's finest restaurants. His second reaction was anger, the kind of indignant fury that comes from being interrupted during a private moment by someone who clearly didn't belong in this space. Marcus opened his mouth to call for security, to demand an explanation, to express his outrage at this unacceptable intrusion. But before he could say a word, Sophie spoke, her voice high and urgent and carrying through the silent restaurant. "You can't eat that, mister. It'll hurt you. It'll hurt your kidneys." Marcus stared at this child who'd just disrupted his meal with such an absurd statement, and his anger transformed into incredulous confusion. Hurt his kidneys? What was this child talking about? He glanced around the restaurant, seeing the frozen tableaus of wealthy diners watching this bizarre scene unfold, seeing Simone rushing toward them with an expression of professional horror, seeing a security guard starting to move in their direction. Marcus raised a hand to stop the security guard, something about Sophie's desperate sincerity cutting through his initial rage. He looked at her more carefully, taking in details he'd missed in his first shock. This wasn't a child playing a prank. Her clothes were worn but clean. Her face was earnest and frightened. Her hands were shaking. She looked like she'd been crying recently, and there was something in her eyes that reminded Marcus of something he hadn't thought about in years, a desperate intensity that came from caring about something more than yourself. Marcus's voice, when he finally spoke, was controlled but cold. "What are you talking about? Who are you?" Sophie took a breath, trying to calm herself, trying to explain in a way this wealthy stranger would understand. "That beef, it's raw, and it's really high in purines. And if you have kidney problems, or if your kidneys aren't working right, it can make you really sick. It can cause acute kidney injury. I know because it happened to my mom. Please, I'm not trying to be bad. I didn't want you to get hurt like she did." The words tumbled out in a rush, medical terminology mixed with childish grammar, and Marcus found himself caught between irritation at this disruption and genuine curiosity about what this child was saying. Simone had reached the table now, apologizing profusely, trying to escort Sophie away, but Marcus surprised everyone by raising his hand again, signaling for Simone to wait. He looked at Sophie with an expression that was hard to read, and he asked a question that would prove crucial. "Who told you about this?" "About kidneys and purines." Sophie explained about her mother, about the kidney disease, about the hours in the library learning everything she could, about the liver pate incident 6 weeks ago, about her mother being in the hospital right now, dying because they couldn't afford the treatment that could save her. As Sophie spoke, something shifted in the restaurant's atmosphere. Other diners were listening now, not with the voyeuristic interest of people watching drama unfold, but with something deeper, an uncomfortable recognition that this child's desperate intervention was revealing truths that luxury and privilege usually keep hidden. One woman at a nearby table quietly pushed away her own plate of beef tartare, her expression troubled. Marcus Wellington sat very still, his business instincts and personal emotions warring inside him. Part of him wanted to dismiss this entire situation as the unfortunate intrusion of poverty into his privileged world, to simply tip the staff generously and forget this uncomfortable moment. But another part of him, a part he'd thought he'd lost somewhere between his first million and his first billion, was recognizing something profoundly important in what this child was saying. He asked Sophie a question that surprised even himself. "Is your mother really in the hospital right now?" Sophie nodded, tears finally spilling over, and she whispered, "She's at County General. She's been there all day. I snuck out to come here because I heard people talking about this restaurant and this food, and I thought if I couldn't save my mom, maybe I could save someone else's mom or dad. I know it sounds stupid. I know I shouldn't have come here. But I couldn't do nothing." The silence that followed Sophie's confession was profound. Marcus Wellington, a man who'd negotiated billion-dollar deals without flinching, who'd fired employees without losing sleep, who'd built an empire on calculated risk and ruthless efficiency, felt something crack inside his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. It was empathy, raw and uncomfortable and impossible to ignore. He looked at this 8-year-old girl who'd traveled across the city alone, who'd pushed past her fear and social barriers, who'd risked humiliation and punishment, all because she'd somehow convinced herself that warning a stranger about a potential health risk was more important than her own safety or comfort. And he realized something that would haunt him. Sophie had probably saved his life, or at least prevented serious harm, Because Marcus Wellington had a secret that nobody in this restaurant knew, that very few people in his life knew at all. He had polycystic kidney disease, an inherited condition that had been diagnosed 5 years earlier. His kidneys functioned at about 40% capacity. He was monitored regularly by a team of private doctors who managed his condition with medications that cost thousands of dollars per month. He followed a carefully controlled diet, or at least he was supposed to. But lately, he'd been ignoring those dietary restrictions, convincing himself that his wealth and access to the best medical care made him invincible, that rules about nutrition and health were for people who couldn't afford to buy their way out of consequences. Marcus reached for his water glass with a hand that wasn't entirely steady, and he asked Sophie to sit down in the empty chair across from him, a request that shocked Simone and every staff member watching. But Marcus wasn't asking. He was telling, using the tone of command that came from decades of being obeyed without question. Sophie sat, looking small and terrified in the luxurious chair, and Marcus did something he hadn't done in years. He had an honest conversation with someone who had absolutely nothing to gain from telling him what he wanted to hear. He explained about his own kidney disease, about how he'd been ignoring his doctor's warnings, about how the beef tartare he'd been about to eat was indeed on the list of foods he was supposed to avoid strictly. He explained that people with compromised kidney function shouldn't consume high-purine foods like organ meats or certain red meats, especially raw, because their damaged kidneys couldn't properly process the byproducts. Sophie listened with the intense focus of someone who understood exactly what he was describing, and when he finished, she said something simple but devastating. "So you were going to hurt yourself on purpose? Even though you could afford not to? Even though you have doctors and medicine and all the things my mom can't have?" The question hung in the air like an accusation, and Marcus had no good answer because there wasn't one. He'd been taking his privilege for granted, treating his health as something he could afford to gamble with, while this child's mother was dying specifically because she lacked the resources he wasted thoughtlessly. What happened next became the part of the story that went viral, that got shared millions of times across social media platforms, that sparked countless debates and think pieces and, eventually, real change. Marcus Wellington made a decision in that moment that would alter the trajectory of multiple lives. He asked Sophie for her mother's name and what hospital she was at. He pulled out his phone, made a call to his personal attorney, right there at the table, ignoring every rule of restaurant etiquette, and instructed him to do whatever was necessary to get Lin Chun immediate access to dialysis treatment and to get her on every possible transplant list with priority status. Money, Marcus explained in a tone that brooked no argument, was not a factor. Cost was irrelevant. He wanted the best nephrologists in Chicago at County General within 2 hours, and he wanted Lin Chun treated with the same level of care that his own doctors would provide. Sophie sat frozen, not quite believing what she was hearing, afraid that if she moved or spoke, this impossible moment would shatter like a dream. But it wasn't a dream. Within minutes, Marcus had mobilized resources that most people couldn't access in a lifetime. He called the hospital administrator directly, someone he knew from charity board meetings, and explained that he was personally guaranteeing all costs for Lin Chen's treatment. He called his own nephrologist, Dr. Sarah Patel, one of the country's leading kidney specialists, and asked her to consult on Lin's case immediately, regardless of her schedule or previous commitments. But Marcus didn't stop there, and this is where the story transcends a simple tale of one wealthy man helping one poor family. As he made these calls, as he watched Sophie's disbelieving face transform from despair to hope, Marcus had an epiphany about the profound injustice of a system where someone like him could access world-class health care while someone like Lin Chun was left to die despite being every bit as deserving of life. He asked Sophie if she'd be willing to tell her story, not just to him, but publicly. He wanted to document what had happened, to make it impossible to ignore, to use his platform and resources to shine a light on the healthcare disparities that allowed situations like Lin's to exist. Sophie, with a wisdom beyond her years, asked why he cared, why he wanted to help when he didn't know her or her mother, when they were nothing to him. Marcus gave her an answer that was more honest than anything he'd said in years. Because you cared enough about a stranger to try to save them even though nobody had ever done the same for you. Because you saw someone in danger and your first instinct was to help, not to look away. Because you're 8 years old and you're braver and more compassionate than I've been in decades. And because if I don't do something with all this money and power I've spent my life accumulating, then what's the point of any of it? That conversation in the Meridian restaurant lasted 2 hours. Other diners came and went, but nobody at table 17 moved. Marcus ordered Sophie food, actual food, not expensive culinary experiments, and watched her eat with the focused intensity of someone who hadn't had a proper meal in longer than she wanted to admit. He asked about her life, her mother's work, her dreams for the future. Sophie told him about wanting to become a doctor so she could help people like her mom, about the library where she studied, about the fear that lived in her chest every day that she'd come home and find her mother dead. She told him things she'd never told anyone because there'd never been anyone to tell, and Marcus listened with an attention he rarely gave to anyone, even in billion-dollar negotiations. At one point, Simone approached the table quietly and whispered that the other guests were asking what was happening, whether everything was all right. Marcus looked around the restaurant, at all these wealthy people who'd been watching this scene unfold, and he made another impulsive decision. He stood up, still holding Sophie's hand, and he addressed the entire restaurant in a voice that commanded attention. Marcus told everyone what had happened, about Sophie's intervention, about his own kidney disease, about how this child had potentially saved him from a medical crisis by caring enough to act when she had every reason to be focused solely on her own family's tragedy. He told them about Lin Chun dying in a county hospital while he'd been about to eat a $45 appetizer that could have seriously harmed him, oblivious to his privilege and the suffering of others. He told them that Sophie represented something fundamentally broken in American society, that we'd created a system where brilliant, caring, courageous children like her had to watch their parents die from treatable conditions while wealthy people squandered resources on careless excess. And then Marcus did something that changed his reputation forever. He challenged every person in that restaurant to do something meaningful with their resources, to find one person or family struggling with medical costs and help them, to use their privilege to address the inequality that made stories like Sophie's possible. He announced that he was establishing a foundation with an initial endowment of $100 million specifically to help families facing catastrophic medical expenses related to kidney disease and other chronic conditions that impoverished people disproportionately. The restaurant erupted in applause, but Marcus wasn't done. He looked at Sophie and asked her if she wanted to go see her mother, and when she nodded eagerly, he called for his driver to bring the car around. The drive from the Meridian to County General Hospital was a journey between worlds. Marcus's private car, a vehicle worth more than most houses, pulled up to a public hospital that served the poorest residents of Chicago, a place where the emergency room was always overcrowded and the staff was perpetually overworked and underfunded. Marcus had never been inside a county hospital before, had never needed to be, and walking through those doors with Sophie was a revelation. The waiting room was packed with people, families huddled together in plastic chairs, children sleeping on their parents' laps, the smell of antiseptic and anxiety thick in the air. This was the America that Marcus's world had been carefully insulated from, the reality that his wealth allowed him to ignore. Sophie led him through the corridors with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd made this journey too many times, and when they reached Lin Chen's room, Marcus saw firsthand the difference between the medical care he took for granted and what was available to people without resources. Lin was in a shared room with 3 other patients, the beeping of monitors and the groans of suffering creating a soundtrack of institutional healthcare stretched beyond capacity. Sophie rushed to her mother's bedside, and Lin woke slowly, her face lighting up when she saw her daughter before clouding with confusion when she noticed the well-dressed stranger standing awkwardly in the doorway. Marcus introduced himself simply, without fanfare, and explained what Sophie had done, what she'd prevented, how her daughter's compassion and knowledge had intervened in his life in a way he'd never forget. Lin Shun, weak and disoriented from her condition, struggled to process this surreal situation, but when Marcus explained that he'd arranged for her to receive treatment, that doctors were on their way, that she wouldn't have to worry about costs or insurance or any of the bureaucratic nightmares that had been killing her as surely as her disease, Lin started crying. These weren't tears of joy, not exactly. They were tears of relief so profound it was almost painful, The release of months of carrying impossible weight, the desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, she'd get to see her daughter grow up after all. Within an hour, Dr. Sarah Patel arrived with two other specialists, and they immediately began a full assessment of Lynn's condition. They moved her to a private room, something that didn't officially exist in the public hospital, but that Marcus's phone call to the hospital administrator had somehow manifested. They started her on medications that she'd never been able to afford. They scheduled emergency dialysis with equipment that was state-of-the-art compared to what county hospitals typically had access to. And they began the process of getting her on transplant lists with the kind of priority that money and influence could buy. Sophie watched all of this happen with an expression that cycled between disbelief, relief, and something deeper, a kind of existential confusion about why her mother's life had suddenly become valuable when nothing about her mother had changed except a wealthy man's attention. That confusion would later drive Sophie to become one of the youngest activists for healthcare reform. But in that moment, she was just an 8-year-old girl who'd run out of tears and was holding her mother's hand like she'd never let go. Marcus stayed at the hospital for hours, watching the medical team work, observing the stark differences between the care his intervention had secured and the care that everyone else in the county hospital system received. He saw elderly patients waiting hours for basic care. He saw families receiving devastating diagnoses with no path forward because treatments weren't covered by insurance or Medicaid. He saw nurses and doctors doing their best with impossible caseloads and inadequate resources. And he understood, perhaps for the first time in his privileged life, that the American healthcare system was a lottery where birth circumstances determined who lived and who died, and that his own survival and quality of life had nothing to do with being more deserving and everything to do with being more fortunate. Before Marcus left the hospital that night, he had a private conversation with Sophie that she'd later describe as life-changing. He told her that what she'd done took courage that most adults never manage, that her instinct to help others, even when she was suffering herself, represented the kind of moral clarity that the world desperately needed. He told her that he wanted to help her get the education she deserved, that he'd be establishing a scholarship fund in her name for children of parents with chronic illnesses who wanted to pursue careers in medicine or healthcare advocacy. But most importantly, he told her something that Sophie would carry with her for the rest of her life. "You saved my life today, Sophie. Not just because you stopped me from eating something dangerous, but because you reminded me that having resources means having responsibility. You showed me that caring about strangers isn't weakness. It's the most important kind of strength. Don't ever lose that, no matter how hard the world tries to teach you to look away from other people's suffering." Sophie asked him a question that cut to the heart of everything. "Will you help other people like my mom? People who don't have kids who can run into fancy restaurants?" Marcus promised that he would, and unlike most promises made by wealthy people to poor children, this was one he'd actually keep. The story of Sophie Chun and Marcus Wellington exploded across social media within 24 hours. Someone in the Meridian restaurant had recorded Marcus's speech on their phone, and that video went viral almost immediately, accumulating millions of views and sparking intense debate about healthcare inequality, wealth responsibility, and the moral obligations of the rich toward the poor. News outlets picked up the story, and suddenly Sophie and her mother were being interviewed by major networks, with Sophie's simple explanation of kidney disease and her desperate intervention resonating with millions of Americans who'd experienced similar struggles with the healthcare system. Marcus kept his promise about the foundation, and the Wellington Healthcare Equity Foundation became one of the fastest-growing charitable organizations in the country, eventually helping thousands of families access treatment for chronic conditions. But the foundation's impact went beyond direct assistance. Marcus used his platform and connections to advocate for policy changes, testifying before Congress about healthcare reform, funding research into making treatments more accessible, and leveraging his business relationships to pressure pharmaceutical companies into more equitable pricing structures. Lynn Chen survived, though it was a close thing. She received dialysis treatment 3 times weekly, managed by the same medical team that treated Marcus's own kidney condition. 8 months after that night in the restaurant, she received a kidney transplant from a deceased donor, a process that had been expedited through legitimate medical protocols, but facilitated by the kind of advocacy and attention that Marcus's involvement brought. She recovered well, And though she'd never have the luxury of taking her health for granted again, she had something that had seemed impossible just months before: a future. She went back to work, but this time at a single job with health benefits, something Marcus had arranged through his network of business contacts. Sophie's life changed in ways both material and psychological. She received a full scholarship to a private school that actually challenged her intellect, with additional tutoring and resources that let her academic gifts flourish. But more than that, she received recognition for something she'd done out of pure compassion, and that recognition helped her understand that her voice and actions mattered, that she didn't have to accept injustice as inevitable. But perhaps the most profound change happened to Marcus Wellington himself. The encounter with Sophie had cracked something open inside him, a realization that couldn't be stuffed back into comfortable ignorance. He started spending time actually understanding the businesses his company worked with, the employees behind the balance sheets, the communities affected by his corporate decisions. He established programs within Wellington Technologies to provide comprehensive health coverage for all employees, including part-time and contract workers, a move that cost his company tens of millions annually, but that he insisted was non-negotiable. He began using his wealth not just to write checks to causes, but to actually engage with the problems that money alone couldn't solve. Showing up at community health clinics, meeting with families struggling with medical debt, listening to stories like Lynn and Sophie's, and understanding that they represented millions of untold tragedies happening in the wealthiest nation on earth. His peers in the billionaire class were confused by this transformation, some dismissing it as a publicity stunt, others quietly admiring what they'd never have the courage to do themselves. But Marcus didn't care about their opinions anymore. He'd been given a gift by an 8-year-old girl, the gift of seeing beyond his own comfortable bubble, and he wasn't going to waste it. 5 years after that night in the Meridian restaurant, Sophie Chen was 13 years old and already recognized as one of the country's youngest healthcare advocates. She'd given a TEDx talk that had been viewed millions of times, spoken at medical conferences about patient perspective and healthcare inequality, and testified before state legislatures about the need for healthcare reform. She'd never forgotten that night, the desperation and fear and impossible hope, and she'd turned that memory into fuel for change. Her mother was healthy, working as an advocate herself for kidney disease patients, helping other families navigate the nightmare of chronic illness without resources. They'd moved to a better neighborhood, not because of Marcus's money directly. He'd been careful not to make them financially dependent, but because Lynn's new job and Sophie's scholarship had opened doors that poverty had kept locked. They still struggled sometimes, because systemic inequality isn't solved by individual acts of kindness. But they had something that had been stolen from them before: agency, the ability to make choices about their lives instead of being trapped by circumstances beyond their control. Marcus Wellington was 61 years old now, and his kidney disease had progressed to the point where he'd needed a transplant himself 3 years earlier. He'd received one, as people with his resources usually do, but the experience of being on the other side of that medical crisis, even with every advantage money could buy, had deepened his commitment to the work Sophie had inspired. The Wellington Healthcare Equity Foundation had helped over 50,000 families access treatment for chronic conditions, had funded dozens of free clinics in underserved communities, and had become a model for how philanthropic resources could be deployed to actually address systemic problems rather than just applying band-aids to symptoms. Marcus had also become a vocal advocate for universal healthcare, using his platform as a business leader to argue that tying healthcare to employment or wealth was morally indefensible and economically short-sighted. He'd lost some friends and business relationships over these positions, but he'd gained something more valuable: the sense that his life had meaning beyond accumulation, that the success he'd achieved actually served a purpose larger than his own comfort. The beef tartare incident, as it became known in the media, had taken on a life of its own as a teaching moment. Medical schools used it as a case study about patient advocacy and the social determinants of health. Business schools discussed it as an example of corporate social responsibility and stakeholder capitalism. Ethics courses debated the moral obligations of wealth and the responsibilities that come with privilege. The video of Marcus's speech in the restaurant was still regularly shared on social media, particularly during debates about healthcare policy, and it had become a cultural touchstone for discussions about inequality. But the real legacy of that night wasn't in the speeches or the foundation or the policy changes, important as those were. The real legacy was in the individual connections that had formed from that moment of intervention. Sophie and Marcus had maintained a relationship over the years, meeting regularly to discuss her education, her advocacy work, and his efforts to make systemic change. He'd become something like a mentor to her, not in a paternalistic way, but as someone who recognized that she had insights and perspectives that his privilege had blinded him to. Lin Chun and Marcus had also developed an unlikely friendship, bonded by their shared experience of kidney disease but enriched by their vastly different perspectives on navigating the healthcare system and American society. One particularly meaningful development came 3 years after the restaurant incident, when Sophie asked Marcus if they could expand the foundation's work to include preventive care and education, not just crisis intervention. She'd realized through her own experience that her mother might never have reached such a critical state if she'd had access to regular medical care and early intervention. Marcus agreed immediately, and they launched the Early Care Initiative, providing free health screenings and preventive treatment in communities that lacked access to primary care. The program saved countless lives by catching conditions like kidney disease, diabetes, and heart disease before they became catastrophic, and it operated on the principle that healthcare should be a right, not a privilege determined by socioeconomic status. Sophie was heavily involved in designing the program, bringing the perspective of someone who'd lived through the failures of the system rather than just studied them from a distance. Her insights about the barriers that prevented people from seeking care, the cost, the time off work, the fear of discovering something wrong they couldn't afford to treat, shaped the program's approach in ways that purely top-down charity never could have achieved. The Meridian restaurant itself became an unexpected part of this story's legacy. After the incident went viral, the restaurant faced criticism from some quarters for initially trying to remove Sophie, though others defended their actions as reasonable given the circumstances. The restaurant's owner, Pierre Cousteau, made a decision that surprised many. He established a program where one night per month, the restaurant would close its regular service and instead host community members from underserved neighborhoods, providing them with the same fine dining experience that wealthy patrons paid hundreds of dollars for, free of charge. More than that, he hired several people from those communities to work in his kitchen and front of house, providing training and career paths in the culinary industry for people who'd never have had access to that world otherwise. Pierre said in an interview that Sophie's intervention had made him question the purpose of his restaurant. Was it just to serve expensive food to wealthy people, or could it be something more meaningful? The monthly community dinners became celebrated events, covered extensively in food media, and several other high-end restaurants across the country adopted similar programs, slowly chipping away at the segregation between worlds of privilege and poverty that American society had normalized. The broader impact of Sophie's story rippled outward in ways that were hard to quantify but impossible to deny. Studies showed that charitable donations to healthcare-related causes spiked significantly after the video went viral, with particular increases in donations to organizations serving low-income communities. Several major corporations announced expansions of their employee health benefits, explicitly citing the Wellington Healthcare Equity Foundation as inspiration. 3 states passed legislation expanding Medicaid coverage for kidney disease treatment, with legislators directly referencing Sophie's story during floor debates. A major pharmaceutical company, facing intense public pressure after the story brought attention to the cost of dialysis and kidney medications, reduced prices for certain treatments, and established a patient assistance program. These changes wouldn't have happened without broader advocacy movements pushing for healthcare reform. But Sophie's story had provided a human face and emotional resonance that made abstract policy debates suddenly feel urgent and personal to millions of people who'd previously been comfortable ignoring healthcare inequality. But perhaps most significantly, Sophie's intervention inspired a generation of young people to believe that individual actions could matter, that speaking up about injustice wasn't futile, that caring about strangers was strength rather than weakness. Schools across the country began teaching Sophie's story as part of their curriculum, and teachers reported that it sparked some of the most engaged discussions they'd ever witnessed about ethics, responsibility, and social justice. Youth volunteer rates for healthcare-related causes increased measurably in the years following the incident, with many young people citing Sophie as their inspiration for getting involved. A movement called Be Sophie emerged on social media, encouraging young people to identify and address instances of preventable suffering in their communities, to speak up even when it was uncomfortable, to see helping others not as charity, but as moral obligation. The movement led to thousands of small interventions, kids raising money for classmates' medical bills, organizing food drives for families affected by chronic illness, advocating to their schools and local governments for better health resources in their communities. None of these individual actions solved systemic problems, but collectively they represented a shift in consciousness, a generation learning that they didn't have to accept inequality and suffering as inevitable facts of life. Marcus often reflected on how a single moment, a child's desperate intervention lasting perhaps 30 seconds, had set in motion a cascade of changes that continued to expand years later. He'd spent decades building a business empire, accomplishing things that business magazines celebrated as remarkable achievements. But he'd come to understand that the most important moment of his life had been when Sophie Chen knocked a fork out of his hand. That action had saved him not just from a potential medical crisis, but from a much more insidious danger: the spiritual emptiness that comes from having everything and appreciating nothing, from being successful by every measurable standard while failing at the most fundamental level of human existence: caring about the welfare of others. In his speeches about the Foundation's work, Marcus would often say that Sophie had given him a gift more valuable than anything his billions could buy: purpose. She'd shown him that the true measure of a life wasn't in what you accumulated, but in what you did with what you had. That privilege was only meaningful if it was deployed in service of something larger than personal comfort. Sophie, now a teenager with college on the horizon, had thoughts about that night that were characteristically more grounded. When interviewed for a documentary about the Wellington Healthcare Equity Foundation, she was asked if she thought she'd done something heroic. Her response captured the essence of why her story resonated so deeply. "I don't think I did anything special. I just saw someone about to make a mistake that could hurt them, and I tried to stop them. That's what we should all do for each other, not because it's heroic, but because it's basic human decency." The weird part is that we've created a society where that seems unusual, where helping someone you don't know feels like going above and beyond instead of just being normal. My mom taught me that we're all connected, that someone else's suffering should matter to us even if we don't know them personally. I just wish I'd learned earlier that rich people suffer too, that they can be victims of their own privilege and need help just like poor people do. Maybe if we all understood that better, that we're all vulnerable in different ways, we'd stop treating inequality like it's someone else's problem. The irony wasn't lost on Sophie or Marcus that a system designed to keep people like them separated through economics, geography, social structures, and institutional barriers had been breached by desperation, and that breach had created opportunities for connection and change that the system's normal functioning would never have allowed. They talked about this paradox frequently, about how American society was structured to prevent exactly the kind of encounter they'd had, to keep the wealthy insulated from the poor in ways that made ignorance comfortable and empathy unnecessary. Marcus described it as design blindness, the way that privilege came with built-in mechanisms to avoid seeing suffering, while Sophie called it invisible walls, barriers that didn't look like walls but were just as effective at keeping people apart. Both agreed that breaking down those walls, making the invisible visible, forcing encounters between worlds that preferred to pretend the other didn't exist, was essential to any real progress on healthcare inequality or any other form of social injustice. As Sophie prepared to graduate from the private school that Marcus's intervention had made possible, she was accepted to multiple prestigious universities, all of which had learned her story and wanted her in their programs. She chose to study public health and policy, with the goal of becoming the kind of doctor advocate who could work both within the healthcare system and to change it from outside. She'd learned from her experience with Marcus that individual compassion was necessary but insufficient, that systemic problems required systemic solutions, but also that systemic change often began with individual relationships, with one person seeing another person's humanity and refusing to look away. She planned to dedicate her career to ensuring that other families wouldn't face the impossible choices her mother had faced, that healthcare would be treated as a human right rather than a commodity rationed by ability to pay. It was an ambitious goal, maybe an impossible one, but Sophie had learned at age 8 that impossible things sometimes happened when someone cared enough to try. Lin Shun had her own perspective on everything that had unfolded from that desperate night. She'd given several interviews over the years, always reluctant but willing because she understood that her story served a larger purpose. She'd said something in one interview that captured a truth that statistics and policy debates often missed. Before I got sick, I worked hard and followed the rules and thought that was enough. I believed that if you did everything right, the system would take care of you. Getting kidney disease when I couldn't afford treatment taught me that the system only takes care of some people. In which category you fall in has nothing to do with how hard you work or how good a person you are. It's just luck. Luck of being born into wealth, or having the right job, or meeting the right person at the right time. My daughter saved a millionaire's life, and because of that, he saved mine. But what about all the mothers who die because their daughters don't happen to run into someone with resources? What about all the families whose stories don't have a fairy tale ending? That's who I think about every day, because I could have been one of them. And the only difference between dying and surviving was random chance. That randomness, the lottery-like quality of who received help and who didn't, became a central theme in the advocacy work that Sophie, Marcus, and Lynn did together. They argued that a healthcare system that relied on individual acts of charity or lucky encounters was fundamentally unjust, that while their story had a happy ending, it actually proved how broken the system was rather than how well it worked. They pushed for universal healthcare coverage, for regulations on pharmaceutical pricing, for increased funding for public hospitals and community health centers, for all the structural changes that would make Sophie's desperate intervention unnecessary, because everyone would have access to the care they needed. The Foundation's work was intentionally designed to put itself out of business. Marcus would say that his goal was to create a society where the Wellington Healthcare Equity Foundation was no longer needed because healthcare equity was guaranteed by the system itself rather than dependent on charitable intervention. The restaurant encounter had also changed how Marcus thought about his business practices and the broader role of corporations in society. He became a vocal advocate for stakeholder capitalism, arguing that companies had obligations not just to shareholders, but to employees, communities, and society as a whole. He pushed Wellington Technologies to take positions on social issues that other tech companies avoided, using his company's influence to advocate for healthcare reform, worker protections, and economic justice. Some investors criticized these positions as inappropriate political activism that distracted from maximizing profits. But Marcus was unmoved, arguing that a company that prospered while the society around it suffered was ultimately unsustainable and morally bankrupt. He'd learned from Sophie that you couldn't separate business success from social responsibility, that making money while people died from preventable causes wasn't something to celebrate, and that true leadership meant using power to address injustice rather than to insulate yourself from it. 10 years after the beef tartare incident, as Sophie prepared to graduate from medical school, having completed her undergraduate degree in just 3 years and accelerated through her medical training with the same focused determination she'd shown as an 8-year-old, she was invited to give a commencement speech at a major university. She used that platform to reflect on the night that had changed her life and the lessons it had taught her. She spoke about the myth of meritocracy, about how talent and hard work mattered but weren't sufficient in a society structured to advantage some and disadvantage others. She spoke about the moral obligation to use whatever advantages you had, whether that was wealth like Marcus, knowledge like she'd accumulated about kidney disease, or simply the willingness to act like she'd shown in the restaurant, to reduce suffering and increase justice. She spoke about the danger of systems that kept people separate, that made it easy to ignore suffering you didn't directly witness, that let privilege become a cocoon protecting you from uncomfortable truths. And she spoke about hope, not the naive hope that problems would solve themselves, but the determined hope that came from knowing change was possible because she'd seen it happen, because her mother was alive when she shouldn't have been, because a chance encounter had sparked a movement that was still growing. Marcus Wellington attended that graduation speech, sitting in the audience alongside Lin Chun, and both of them cried as they listened to Sophie articulate truths that would have been impossible for her to know at 8 years old, but that her 8-year-old self had somehow intuited and acted upon. After the ceremony, reporters asked Marcus what it felt like to have played such a pivotal role in Sophie's journey, and his answer was characteristically thoughtful. "I didn't play a pivotal role in her journey. She played a pivotal role in mine." Sophie was always going to be remarkable. Her intelligence, her compassion, her courage, those were already there when she knocked that fork out of my hand. All I did was remove some of the obstacles that poverty and inequality had put in her path. The real question isn't what I did for her, but why those obstacles existed in the first place. Why we've built a society where brilliant children like Sophie have to fight so hard just to survive, let alone thrive. That's the question we should all be asking ourselves. And it's the question I ask myself every day. The story of Sophie Chun and Marcus Wellington continued to be told and retold, taking on different meanings for different audiences, but always returning to its essential truth: that human connection across divides of class and privilege was both rare and transformative, that individual actions could matter even in the face of overwhelming systemic problems, and that the most important choices we make are often the ones that cost us something: comfort, safety, or certainty, in service of someone else's welfare. It had become a modern parable, one that captured something fundamental about American society's contradictions: its capacity for both cruelty and compassion, its potential for change, and its resistance to it. And at its heart was an image that millions of people could visualize: a small hand reaching out to stop a stranger from making a mistake, a gesture so simple and so profound that it contained everything necessary to understand about what we owe each other as human beings sharing a world that had enough resources for everyone to thrive, but consistently failed to distribute those resources justly. The story's enduring power came from its refusal to offer easy answers or simple morals. It wasn't just a tale of a kind billionaire helping a poor family. It was more complicated than that, more uncomfortable, more honest about the structural inequalities that made such interventions necessary and the limitations of individual charity in addressing systemic injustice. It acknowledged that Sophie had saved Marcus as surely as he'd saved Lynn. That privilege was its own kind of prison that separated you from human connection and moral clarity. That wealth could buy many things, but couldn't substitute for the kind of purpose that came from being useful to others. And it insisted that everyone had some form of privilege, whether economic, educational, social, or simply the privilege of health. And therefore everyone had the corresponding responsibility to deploy that privilege in ways that reduced rather than increased inequality. If you take away one thing from Sophie Chen's story, let it be this: the distance between you and someone suffering isn't as vast as you think. The walls separating your comfortable life from someone else's desperate struggle aren't as solid as they appear, and the moment when you're called to act, to reach out, to intervene, to care about a stranger, might come when you least expect it. Sophie was just a child when she made the choice to run across a restaurant and knock food from a wealthy man's hand. A choice that could have ended in humiliation or punishment, but instead became the beginning of something transformative. She didn't have a plan or guarantees or any reason to believe her intervention would matter, but she acted anyway because her conscience demanded it, because she'd been raised to believe that other people's welfare was her concern, because she understood something that many adults never learn: that doing nothing in the face of preventable suffering is itself a choice, and often the most consequential one we make. So the next time you see someone in need, whether it's a stranger eating something dangerous, or a family struggling with medical bills, or a classmate who can't afford lunch, or a neighbor dealing with a crisis they're facing alone, remember Sophie Chun. Remember that 8-year-old girl who traveled across a city to warn a stranger about danger, who cared more about someone else's well-being than her own comfort or safety, who proved that individual actions can spark movements, and that compassion isn't weakness, but the foundation of everything that makes human society worth preserving. Remember that we're all connected in ways we usually don't acknowledge, that your choices ripple outward in ways you'll never fully see, and that the most important question you can ask yourself isn't what you can get away with or how much you can accumulate, but what you did with what you had to reduce suffering and increase justice in a world that desperately needs both. If this story moved you, if it made you think differently about privilege and responsibility and the ways we're all connected, then share it with everyone you know. Hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that challenge how we think about society and our place in it. Drop a comment telling us about a time when a stranger's intervention changed your life, or when you intervened in someone else's life, or what you're going to do differently after hearing Sophie's story. And most importantly, find your own way to be Sophie. Identify the suffering in your community that you have the power to address, the injustice you have the privilege to confront, the person you have the capacity to help. Because that's how change happens. Not through waiting for perfect solutions or hoping someone else will act, but through millions of individual choices to see each other's humanity, to care about each other's welfare, and to use whatever resources and advantages we have to build a world where stories like Sophie's have happy endings not because of random chance, but because we've created systems that guarantee everyone's fundamental right to health, dignity, and hope.